B-52s would have been wiped out. The secret American defeat in Operation Linebacker II, December 1972. The skies above Hanoi trembled with fire. In Washington, the decision had been made to unleash the heaviest, most devastating bombing campaign since World War II. The code name was Operation Linebacker II. Its purpose was simple, brutal, and final force North Vietnam to accept American terms at the Paris peace talks. At the center of this strategy stood the B-52 Stratofortress, a giant bomber aircraft, celebrated as America's invincible flying fortress. Since the 1950s, generals had painted the B-52 as the ultimate symbol of American air power. It could carry 30 tons of bombs, fly at altitudes unreachable for most defenses, and deliver destruction on a scale the world had rarely seen. To American planners, the B-52 was untouchable, but history would prove them wrong. From December 18th to December 29th, 1972, for 12 consecutive nights, the U.S. sent wave after wave of B-52s to carpet bomb Hanoi, Haiphong, and other northern strongholds. It was meant to be a shock and awe campaign, the kind that would break the spirit of an entire nation. Officials in Washington were confident within 3 to 5 days, the North Vietnamese will surrender. Instead, what unfolded was something no Pentagon official could have predicted. 34 B-52s destroyed, dozens more damaged, hundreds of American airmen dead or captured, and an entire superpower humiliated before the eyes of the world. The myth of the invincible fortress. To understand the shock of this defeat, one must understand what the B-52 meant to America in 1972. These were not ordinary planes. Each B-52 represented the pride of the U.S. Air Force. They were nuclear capable, designed for global domination, and considered so secure that even in simulations, they were rarely counted as losses. A single B-52 could level an entire district in minutes. Pilots called them death machines. U.S. Propaganda claimed no country in the world can bring down a B-52. The message was clear: resistance was futile. But North Vietnam refused to believe in American myths. Behind the scenes, Vietnamese air defense units studied every pattern, every electronic signal, every weakness. They knew the B-52 was not invincible. It was just a machine. And like any machine, it could be destroyed. The opening strikes. On the night of December 18th, 1972, the sky over Hanoi lit up as 129 B-52s, supported by hundreds of fighter escorts, roared in. The ground shook as tens of thousands of pounds of bombs rained down on the city. Buildings collapsed, hospitals were destroyed, and civilians were buried in rubble. Washington called it precision bombing. In reality, it was carpet bombing, a deliberate attempt to break morale through terror. But that very first night, a shockwave hit the U.S. Command Center. 3 B-52s were shot down. The so-called invincible fortresses fell in flames, scattering wreckage across the countryside. Radio Hanoi broadcast the news worldwide. The world listened in disbelief. The U.S. military dismissed it as luck. Yet the next night, it happened again and again. By the fourth night, American pilots were whispering among themselves, "This is suicide." The secret weapon. Vietnam's air defense. How did a small nation, often described by U.S. officials as primitive, bring down the world's most advanced bombers? The answer lay in the Soviet-supplied SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missiles, combined with Vietnam's own ingenuity. Vietnamese crews modified radar systems, created deceptive signals, and developed ambush tactics. They learned to predict American flight patterns, exploit weaknesses in formation, and fire missiles at the exact moment when B-52s were most vulnerable. It was not luck. It was science, discipline, and sheer determination. By December 20th, after only 3 nights, 9 B-52s had already been destroyed. American commanders were stunned. At this rate, they realized the entire B-52 fleet could be wiped out within weeks. The turning point: Hanoi's fiery nights. By December 21st, the campaign had reached a critical stage. Washington had expected North Vietnam to collapse within 72 hours. Instead, Hanoi still stood. Factories continued working underground. Anti-aircraft crews remained alert. And the leadership Ho Chi Minh's successors refused to bend. That night, as 93 B-52s thundered toward Hanoi, the defenders unleashed a deadly barrage. Radar operators tracked the slow, lumbering bombers as they entered the lethal zone. The order was given: fire within minutes. 2 B-52s erupted into fireballs. One crashed near Pu Tho, another outside Hanoi. American rescue teams were powerless. Flames consumed the aircraft before any crew could eject. By the end of December 21st, the score was undeniable: 12 B-52s destroyed in just 4 nights. For the first time since World War II, the aura of American invincibility was shattered. Western journalists began asking questions. How can the world's mightiest air force lose so many planes to a country so small? Pilots on the edge of panic inside the cockpits. Fear spread like wildfire. Pilots were trained to trust their machines, to believe in the fortress of steel around them. But by December 22nd, whispers echoed through Utapao and Andersen Air Base in Guam. Every mission is a death sentence. One captured pilot later admitted, "We used to believe no one could touch us at 30,000 feet. But when we saw those missiles slicing the sky and hitting our formations, we realized this was not what the generals promised. We were flying coffins." Some crews refused to fly. Others drank heavily before missions, desperate to numb their fear. Morale plummeted, yet Washington demanded more sorties, more fire, more destruction. Christmas bombings, December 24th, 25. By Christmas Eve, the campaign reached a grotesque climax. Hanoi was hammered relentlessly. Civilian neighborhoods burned, hospitals collapsed. Entire families perished in the rubble. Washington hoped that bombing during Christmas would send a psychological message of dominance. But in reality, the opposite happened. The world erupted in outrage. In Paris, protests filled the streets with chants of "Stop the slaughter in Vietnam." In London, the Times published an editorial titled "Christmas of Death." Even in America, church leaders condemned the bombings as a crime against humanity. On Christmas Day, December 25th, Hanoi remained defiant. That night, 5 more B-52s were shot down, making it the single most disastrous day for the U.S. Air Force since the Korean War. The image of flaming wreckage scattered across Hanoi became known worldwide as Dien Bien Phu, in the air. The humiliation of December 26th, 1972, arguably the darkest day for American air power. U.S. commanders threw in their heaviest assault, yet 120 B-52s in one wave, escorted by nearly 100 fighter jets. It was meant to be a decisive blow, but Vietnamese defenders were ready. They had studied U.S. flight patterns and knew the exact corridors of attack. That night, they unleashed their most coordinated missile ambush yet. By dawn, 8 B-52s lay destroyed, their wreckage smoldering across the Red River Delta. Survivors parachuted into fields, captured by villagers who handed them over to local authorities. Photographs of American prisoners pilots once considered untouchable circulated worldwide. For the Pentagon, this was unthinkable. Never in history had the United States lost so many strategic bombers in such a short span of time. The global shockwave international media erupted. Headlines screamed across the globe, U.S. Air might broken over Hanoi, Le Monde. France. The fall of the invincible bomber, The Guardian, UK. America's flying fortresses shot from the sky, Pravda. USSR. Even U.S. allies expressed doubt. Japan and Australia questioned the morality of the campaign. In Europe, anti-war protests intensified. Meanwhile, in Washington, panic set in. Military analysts warned President Nixon. At this rate, the B-52 fleet will not survive another 2 weeks. The cost in lives and machines was simply unsustainable. By December 29th, the final tally was clear: 34 B-52s destroyed, 81 aircraft of all types lost, over 600 American airmen killed or captured. North Vietnam, by contrast, stood firm. Its leadership declared victory, and the world began to see the U.S. not as a superpower enforcing order, but as an empire defeated by a small nation's willpower. The hidden costs. The U.S. tried to bury the numbers. Official statements claimed only 15 B-52s lost, but Vietnamese records, confirmed by eyewitnesses, told another story. 34 destroyed. Why cover up the truth? Because each B-52 cost the equivalent of $50 million in 1970s dollars. Losing 34 meant the U.S. had lost nearly $1.7 billion in aircraft alone, not counting training, maintenance, and the priceless cost of experienced crews. Even worse, the aura of American air superiority, the foundation of U.S. military strategy during the Cold War, was shattered. If a small nation with outdated Soviet missiles could destroy the B-52, what would happen in a real war with the Soviet Union? The Pentagon knew the answer. The myth of invincibility was gone. The downing of 34 B-52s, according to Vietnamese sources, was more than just a military statistic. Each loss represented a direct blow to the very heart of American air power, a symbolic unraveling of the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the big, ugly, fat fellow since its introduction in the 1950s. For the United States, which had deployed the B-52 in countless exercises and nuclear deterrence missions, the bomber was supposed to remain untouchable, flying high above the range of most conventional air defenses. Yet over Hanoi, the unimaginable happened. The fortress in the sky became vulnerable prey, night after night. The skies above North Vietnam turned into a lethal battlefield. The People's Army of Vietnam, equipped with Soviet-supplied SA-2 guideline, surface-to-air missiles, coordinated radar systems, and clever tactics, turned the capital city into one of the most heavily defended airspaces on Earth. Entire missile brigades lay in wait, adapting to the flight patterns of the American bombers, predicting their routes, and launching coordinated salvos. Even when B-52s deployed electronic countermeasures, the Vietnamese gunners found ways to adapt, using overlapping radar tracking and sheer volume of fire to penetrate the defenses. The wreckage of these giant bombers, falling from the night sky, was not only a morale boost for the Vietnamese, but also a devastating psychological shock for the United States. Families back home who had once believed in the B-52's supremacy now received the grim news of missing crews. American airmen, once confident in their machines, began to fly with growing anxiety, knowing that survival was no longer guaranteed. By the end of Operation Linebacker II, Washington had to face a sobering truth: the strategy of overwhelming force had failed. The cost of continuing such a campaign would have been catastrophic. Analysts later concluded that if the raids had persisted for weeks longer, dozens more B-52s might have been lost, further humiliating the United States on the global stage. For North Vietnam, the victory was more than symbolic. The ability to bring down America's most advanced bombers sent a signal not only to Washington, but also to the world: even the mightiest empire could be resisted. This outcome played a direct role in pushing the United States back to the negotiating table in Paris. accelerating the path toward the January 1973 peace agreement. In the eyes of many historians, the destruction of those B-52s forced America to confront the limits of its power. Yet the story did not end with numbers alone. The image of flaming wreckage, captured in propaganda posters, newspapers, and later in museums, became enduring symbols of national pride in Vietnam. For generations, the memory of the so-called Dien Bien Phu in the air cemented the idea that technological superiority could be defeated by determination, strategy, and resilience. And for the United States, Operation Linebacker II remains a scar, an episode often downplayed in official accounts, but impossible to erase from the annals of military history. The very weapon meant to intimidate ended up exposing American vulnerability. The downing of 34 B-52s was not simply a military loss. It forced the United States to confront the unbearable arithmetic of war. Each B-52 represented not only a multi-million-dollar investment, but also the lives of highly trained air crews, the vast logistical chains that supported them, and the fragile illusion of unstoppable American dominance. The U.S. Air Force had entered Linebacker II with confidence that saturation bombing would break Hanoi's resistance. Instead, America encountered a reality that would echo through the corridors of the Pentagon for decades. One of the most overlooked aspects of this campaign was the strain it placed on American pilots and crews. B-52 crews often flew multiple dangerous missions in quick succession, sometimes with only a few hours of rest. As more bombers fell, the tension inside the cockpits grew unbearable. Men spoke of the constant fear of radar locks, the sudden flash of incoming missiles, and the helplessness of sitting in a giant, lumbering machine with little ability to evade. Survivors recalled hearing explosions in the sky around them, watching fellow bombers erupt in flames, and then being forced to complete their mission as though nothing had happened. By the third or fourth night of heavy raids, morale was plummeting. The myth of the invincible bomber had been shattered from within. Meanwhile, in Hanoi, the Vietnamese defense network adapted with astonishing speed. Commanders analyzed American flight paths, predicting the rigid racetrack patterns that the B-52s often used. This predictability became fatal. SAM operators learned to wait until bombers committed to their final approach, unleashing coordinated barrages that overwhelmed countermeasures. To conserve precious missiles, North Vietnamese units rotated firing zones, ensuring that each attack delivered maximum impact. Far from being a passive victim of American technology, Hanoi transformed into a deadly trap, one that swallowed America's most prized aircraft whole. In Washington, the reports arriving from the battlefield caused alarm at the highest levels. Every B-52 lost reverberated through the political and military establishment. Hawks argued that America must double down, escalate, and crush Hanoi once and for all. Doves, however, pointed to the escalating costs and warned that America was on the verge of another quagmire. The Nixon administration faced a critical dilemma: continue pressing with a campaign that risked further humiliation, or step back and salvage what could still be claimed as a strategic victory. The propaganda war was equally fierce. North Vietnam seized upon every wreckage, broadcasting triumphant images of captured bomber fragments, downed engines, and even captured American pilots. International audiences, already skeptical of U.S. involvement, saw in these images proof that the Vietnamese were not only surviving but defeating one of the most powerful militaries on Earth. For the anti-war movement in America, the news of falling B-52s confirmed what activists had long claimed: the war was unwinnable, immoral, and destroying America's credibility abroad. Financially, the impact was staggering. Each B-52 bomber cost upwards of $8 million in the early 1970s, equivalent to more than $50 million today. Losing 34 of them meant a direct material loss of nearly $500 million, not including the cost of training, equipment, support crews, and the irreplaceable lives of skilled airmen. More importantly, it showed that even America's most advanced war machine could be humbled by determined resistance, altering strategic calculations not just in Vietnam, but across the Cold War theater. Perhaps the most lasting consequence was psychological. Within military planning circles, the specter of Hanoi haunted future operations. If the U.S. could lose so many B-52s to 1960s-era missiles, what would happen in a confrontation with the Soviet Union itself? Could fleets of American bombers survive a nuclear strike mission against Moscow or Leningrad, knowing that even a relatively small, resource-limited country had inflicted such damage? The losses in Linebacker II cast doubt on decades of nuclear war planning, subtly undermining the credibility of America's strategic deterrent. And then came the political fallout. The Nixon administration, already weakened by the Watergate scandal, could not afford endless losses. The public, weary of years of war, erupted in protest as casualty numbers grew. Congress began questioning the legitimacy of pouring more resources into a war that seemed increasingly futile. In the end, the decision to halt the bombing campaign and return to the negotiating table was not simply a choice for peace, but a recognition that continuing the assault risked further humiliation. For Vietnam, the victory became immortalized as Dien Bien Phu Tren Quang, the Dien Bien Phu in the air. Just as the 1954 battle had forced French colonial forces to abandon their ambitions, Linebacker II forced the Americans to reconsider theirs. The downing of the B-52s was celebrated as proof that small nations could stand against great powers, a lesson etched into Vietnamese national memory and proudly taught to future generations. In the decades since, the legacy of those nights in December 1972 continues to resonate. Museums in Hanoi display wreckage from fallen B-52s as trophies of resilience. American archives, by contrast, often soften or obscure the scale of losses, reluctant to admit just how costly the campaign had become. But for historians, the facts remain unavoidable. Operation Linebacker II revealed both the power and the fragility of modern warfare, reshaping the course of U.S. strategy and hastening the end of America's most divisive war. The aftershocks of Linebacker II extended far beyond Vietnam. Within the Pentagon, analysts dissected every aspect of the campaign. They examined why so many bombers had been lost, how North Vietnamese defenses had adapted, and what these lessons meant for future conflicts. The conclusions were sobering. American air superiority, often touted as absolute, had proven vulnerable when confronted by disciplined, adaptive defenders armed with Soviet technology. This realization quietly reshaped American strategy. In the years following Vietnam, the U.S. military invested heavily in stealth technology, precision-guided munitions, and electronic warfare systems. The invincible B-2 Spirit bomber and the F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter were direct responses to the nightmare of Hanoi's SAM networks. The doctrine shifted from brute force saturation bombing to surgical strikes that minimized exposure. In many ways, the ghosts of those 34 B-52s became the architects of America's next generation of war machines. Yet, while technology advanced, the psychological wound remained. Veterans of the campaign described lingering doubts about whether their sacrifices had meaning. Pilots who had survived multiple missions over Hanoi recalled feeling like pawns in a political chess game, risking their lives for objectives that shifted daily. Families of the lost airmen struggled with grief, compounded by the secrecy and ambiguity that surrounded the missions. For them, the wreckage displayed in Hanoi was not a symbol of triumph, but a reminder of irreparable loss. On the Vietnamese side, the victory was woven into national identity. Propaganda posters, songs, and literature celebrated the air defense heroes who had humbled the world's most powerful air force. For decades, school children in Vietnam learned that determination, strategy, and courage could overcome even the most daunting odds. The ruins of downed B-52s were preserved as historical relics, serving as both memorials and warnings. No foreign power could impose its will on Vietnam without paying a terrible price. Internationally, the implications were profound. Allies and adversaries alike studied Linebacker II closely. NATO partners worried about the vulnerability of their own air forces if confronted with Soviet air defenses in Europe. The Warsaw Pact, meanwhile, celebrated the effectiveness of its missile systems, taking pride in how relatively outdated technology had devastated America's fleet. In Moscow, the success of the SAM operators in Vietnam was seen as validation of Soviet military doctrine, boosting confidence that the USSR could hold its own in a direct confrontation with the United States. For the American public, the losses added another layer of disillusionment. By 1972, support for the war was already in sharp decline. The Pentagon Papers had exposed decades of deception. The My Lai massacre had shattered illusions of moral superiority. Now, the loss of dozens of invincible B-52s made it clear that even America's technological advantage could not guarantee victory. Protesters seized upon these failures as evidence that the war had become not only immoral, but strategically bankrupt. The narrative that the U.S. could impose democracy through overwhelming firepower crumbled under the weight of reality. In hindsight, Linebacker II has been described by historians as both a tactical failure and a strategic paradox. Tactically, the losses were unacceptable. No air campaign could sustain such attrition. Strategically, however, the shock of the bombing did push Hanoi back to the negotiating table, paving the way for the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973. But even this success was fleeting. Within 2 years, South Vietnam collapsed, and the very peace America claimed to enforce proved illusory. The B-52s had rained destruction upon Hanoi, but they could not change the trajectory of history. This raises an uncomfortable truth. Linebacker II was less about victory than about face-saving. For President Nixon, it was an attempt to exit the war from a position of strength, to prove that America had not been defeated on the battlefield. But the reality was stark. 34 bombers lay in pieces across North Vietnam. Hundreds of American families mourned their dead. Billions of dollars had been spent. And yet, the political outcome remained unchanged. The United States withdrew, its reputation scarred, its military humbled, and its society deeply divided. The lessons of Linebacker II echo into the present. They serve as a warning against overconfidence, against the assumption that technology alone can secure victory, and against the illusion that overwhelming firepower can break the will of determined opponents. They remind us that wars are not won by machines, but by strategy, morale, and political resolve. Even today, in discussions of modern air campaigns from Kosovo to Iraq to Ukraine, the specter of Hanoi looms large. Military planners remember how a small, resource-limited nation turned America's most advanced bombers into burning wrecks. They remember how images of downed aircraft fueled global resistance and undermined political will at home. And they remember how, in the end, the pursuit of victory through overwhelming force only hastened defeat. Ultimately, the story of the 34 B-52s is not just about machines of war. It is about hubris, resilience, and the limits of power. It is about a superpower learning at a terrible cost that even the mightiest arsenal cannot guarantee victory. And it is about a small nation, bloodied but unbroken, proving that determination can humble even the most formidable adversary.